today. But before I do that, I just want to say that you are most welcome with questions, but since this is recorded, you have to ask your questions in this mic. So take your questions in the end of the talk, and then I will run around with this microphone so you can get the word. Okay? So now to our speakers. We have Mejke Schalk and Therese Kristiansson that will talk about feminist futures of spatial practice. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. We will speak. I will speak first and make a more general introduction about. Hello. Yeah. We have had a little bit of technical problems, so it can happen that because the system doesn't recognize my. You don't have. Okay. Yeah. Right. So these things can happen all the time during this presentation. We apologize for that. So I will speak more generally about that book, and Therese, who is one of the co-editors of the book beside Ramia Mazet, who is not here today. She will speak about her chapter, which she has co-written with her group, the Design Art Architecture Collective MYCKET, which translates for non-Swedish speakers, which translate into much. Okay, so this book is called Feminist Futures of Spatial Practice, Materialisms, Activisms, Dialogues, Pedagogies, Projections. And all these activities we see as possibilities to critically re-examine spatial practices in order to make changes. So under spatial practices, we understand all activities that deal with space, such as planning, policy making, architecture, design, but also everyday activities. And I am a researcher and a teacher. I'm educated as an architect in Berlin and in London. And my practice is mostly, as we speak very much about practice in that book, is mostly within research. It's in writing, it's in teaching, and I do rather small-scale projects on commission of art and architecture institutions where I do not deal with, how to say, clients or providing some services for clients, but where I'm fairly free to develop research into practice, you could say. And Therese, to introduce her, she's educated as an architect at KTH here, and she has also a degree in art in the public realm from Kunstfach. And she currently works together with the group MYCKET, together with Mariana Alves Silva, who is a graphic designer, and with Dr. Katrina Bonnevier, who is an architect and a researcher as well, I could say. And you are conducting, and that will be one of the topics you are speaking about later on, you actually do conduct projects where you get commissions from the city of Gothenburg, for example. So I will present the making of the book, the main themes, and Therese will present her article, which is called Through Our Dance, We Weave the Dance Floor and the Ceiling, a Conversation Amongst Mejke. And as we said already, please feel free to ask us any questions in the middle of the presentations in English or in Swedish, as you wish, actually. So the book started with a course that Therese and me were teaching together in 2011 already. And for the first time, this is a course we regularly have been teaching, not we, but together with colleagues in the critical studies section at the School of Architecture. But that was the first time that this course actually had a title, and that was Feminist Futures. And the specific with this particular course was that we relocated it from the university to a more public space. We moved to the vicinities of WISP, which stands for Swedish Women in Performing Arts.
And actually, I don't think you know, but Rebecca Lindhagen, who used to work for WISP, is here. Oh.
Hi, yeah, we have met at several occasions. Great that you are here. So we opened the course to the public, you could say. And the course consisted in 2 parts. There were lectures, and then there were also workshops. So the idea to speak about feminist futures particularly had also a purpose to sort of take in, read feminist theory, but then also speculate on what could the future of a feminist practice, what could that be, what could such a practice be, and how could you conduct that practice, and how could you also transform practice. So we always have dealt with feminist theory as a base in our research and teaching for quite some time, and we felt that there was lack of really hands-on examples in spatial practices under which we, as I said, understand really a wide range of activities from professional side, also from, let's say, activist groups or grassroots movements, and we see also a connection here of theory and practice in these. Now, since very recently, there is a huge discussion about feminist urban planning or feminist city planning, maybe since 2 years in the media, and during this very short time, already new policies have been made. For example, the communal housing companies, they have included feminist city planning as a term in their statutes. There is MYCKET, which is, how do you translate MYCKET? It's not really a ministry. I mean, there's MYCKET, everybody who speaks Swedish knows what it is. And here you can, for example, apply for money in order to further to work towards interpret feminist city planning, what that could be. There's also Vinnova, which is a research funding that specifically practitioners can search for, that also supports questions of equality, questions of norm critique specifically. So that could be interesting for every one of you who really works within spatial practices, that there are possibilities to apply for money. And I think you will say a little bit more about the importance of that, because we haven't seen very many examples yet of feminist city planning. So we will, and hopefully we will see that in the future. So when we did the course, and after that course, we felt the urgency to develop this material into a book, for handing it on, for reproducing our knowledge, giving it to the next generations. We really wanted to rethink our values that are enacted through our practices. And our questions here was, can we act, each and every one of us, from within our everyday and professional practices as part of larger socio-political entities in the here and now, and can we affect the future? So arguing that feminism continues to be one of the most powerful movements for social justice, Bell Hooks, activist and educator, posits feminism as a broad vision for the rights of all bodies, identities, and voices. So she says, she articulates, feminist movement happens when groups of people come together with an organized strategy to take action to eliminate patriarchy. And she traces in her book, Visionary Feminism, she traces from 2000, she traces a long history of Black liberation, women's liberation from the 1960s, 70s, to a feminist legacy that established itself through activism and scholarship, a more intellectual activism, perhaps in the 80s and 90s, to a recent huge interest in feminist theory in order to explore differences and to empower the construction of more just futures. So architecture and the arts and other spatial practices have never been neutral in social struggles. And even when architecture and planning is often seen specifically architecture and design, as being into service, being a client profession that serves clients and not necessarily as a critical practice. So even in the most trivial act of reproduction, one's own practice, you could say, there are openings and possibilities to either conforming and affirming existing values, or for divergence, transformation, and for change. So that was probably a very important point of departure, and as an answer, a part answer of our question in the start. So these possibilities, they give rise to the futurity inherent in architecture, as the philosopher Elisabeth Gross, as she's an Australian philosopher, has written extensively about architecture. So she has formulated, the future is that openness of becoming that enables divergences from what exists, and she has also coined the term embodied utopias, which I, if we have time, can explain later on a little bit in that respect. So, indeed, architecture and the arts have long been at the forefront of socio-spatial struggles in which equal access to spaces and resources, but also to representation and expression, are at stake in our communities, cities, states, world politics, and in everyday lives. And in this book, there are examples of spatial struggles that happen in the public realm, but there are also many examples of a struggle for equal representation. So the book is structured in these 5 themes, you could say, and I guess most of the struggles for public space happens in the activism section. So I have 2 short examples that you understand what we're talking about. So Doina Petrescu, in her chapter, Being in Relations and Reinventing the Commons, discusses the transformation of a public piece of land in a small town called Colombes of Paris, where she and in her practice, together with inhabitants or neighbors, have transformed a piece of land, and this started as a European Union project into a test site for learning, for resilience, and so there are facilities for growing and for recycling, for example, and this project has been featured in international press quite extensively. The project was not, how to say, was put in place by a green government, and when the government changed to a conservative one, the new mayor didn't want the project any longer, so it was threatened, and finally they had to move out. But because of this huge interest in the press, there was this possibility that other cities got really interested in this kind of work. So they have relocated now to another town, and there's also the idea that this project can be reproduced for other places. That's one of the chapters in the book. Another one of the chapters in the book is by Yvonne P. Doderer in her chapter Strategies Used by Women in Resistance, the example of Stuttgart 21 in Germany, which discusses the gender dimensions of resistance to large-scale urban development projects. So she was interested in understanding here who usually gets to speak on demonstration and protests, and further in more subversive techniques of resistance, such as silent protests, performances, but also the reproductive part of the struggle, who organizes the meeting points, who produces the information material, who takes care of protesters that get hurt in the struggle, and so on and so on. So other contributors focused on the issue of struggle for spatial representation, such as Nishat Awan, for example, in her work Mapping Otherwise, Imagining Other Possibilities and Other Futures, in which she mapped, together with participants from the diasporic Kurdish community in London, their facilities, or they were basically looking how the community was spatially distributed in London, and compared that to Kurdish cities and to Kurdish streets and even neighborhoods or so. So she searches also for other forms of representation in her mapping. So the mapping becomes for her a possibility of imagining other futures by those who have journeyed across geographies and cultures. And then we have a project by Ragnhild Claesson, who is a conservationist, where she discusses conflicting identities and priorities in the notion of cultural heritage within an increasingly diverse Swedish society. And she questions some of the existing definitions of cultural heritage as fundamentally patriarchal. So instead, she argues that we, in a more and more diversified society, we need cultural heritage, we need new terms for cultural heritage that can take on notions of diversity. She speaks about local constructions, I mean a global view and a local view on the terms in which memories, artifacts and knowledges are situated. So in her project she made, together with an association of women in Malmö, she made proposals for public spaces in Malmö, which included artifacts that are not, that represent more than one history, that might present several histories. And she also presented that and discussed that with planners in Malmö. So the last example here is Sara Brolund de Carvalho and Anna Linja in the section of pedagogies. In their project Urban Caring, which also includes a film, investigated as typical half-souterrain places in the suburb, in a 1950s suburb in Stockholm, which are, occupied by a range of neighborhood associations, but also small-scale economical activities, such as a drumming school for girls or a feminist tattoo studio. Typically activities that couldn't survive if the city would look like the way how it is built nowadays. So they thought it is really important to lift those qualities of spaces that have been produced during a time when there was more focus on building common spaces or communal spaces, spaces for commoning, you could say, that would be easy to access and that would be affordable to pay for, as towards an urbanism or a culture of urban care, how they call that. So these were just a few examples of the book. I wanted to, in order to sum this up, to go into a few of the terminologies we were using, for example, critical spatial practice, which is a term that was coined by the writer and theorist, architecture theorist and historian Jane Rendell, where she says basically that spatial practice is nowadays really a broad term for architectural, artistic, design and other disciplinary and interdisciplinary practices engaged in studying and transforming space. But a critical spatial practice in this is that projects that put forward questions as the central tenet of the research instead of, or as well as solving and resolving problems. And this way of questioning tends to produce objects that critically rethink the parameters of the problem itself. So she sees a really important a necessity to ask completely different questions if you would like to arrive at different results. And I think a good example for architecture, for example, is, one of the key issues here is, of course, interdisciplinarity and collaboration, because we nowadays in spatial practices, we deal with such a complexity that it's not possible any longer to simply look only to your own, discipline. It's really, if you take the term sustainability, then I would say architects and planners might not know as much as they should know about it as other professions. So there is an urgent need to learn to collaborate on future cities, to develop future cities. So in the book, you could say that there was also, besides developing tools and interpreting theory or developing even theory, there was also an urge to develop methods. And so beside that, all the contributors used established methods in research, such as backcasting in future studies, action research, or participatory action research that are recognized in research. The contributors also try to formulate methods their own methods, so to say, where they saw a kind of a seed for development for the future. And these things were, for example, I just read some of you, silent protest, commoning, carnivalesque interventions. Therese will speak about that a little bit more. Then redoing heritage, urban caring, instructing conversation, rehearsals, mapping otherwise, producing spaces of feminist anticipation, introducing counter-narratives, or developing other types of city visions, ludic resistance, foregrounding old and new radicalisms, and decolonizing thought, for example. Where are we in time? 15 minutes. I just say something very short about futures then, because that was probably the other really big, huge topic we were approaching. So in general, you can say that feminism offers an optimistic outlook on the future, because every feminist politics believes that things can change and that for the better in the future. But nonetheless, there are very many varying feminisms who have different ideas how that future should look like. So I have just lined up here 3 different viewpoints that were really important for us. That's Bell Hooks, who thinks that feminist theory is one of the most important points of departure, but also that we are able to build up environments, inspiring environments where we can meet and discuss, for example, like a university, where we find facilities, spaces are really important, that we have access to spaces, that this is affordable for us, that we find groups of people that we can discuss with. Learning environments are important, but also the pedagogy itself is really crucial, that we rethink our pedagogies in a feminist way for what we would like, what are they, should they help for producing in the future. And Elisabeth Gross, the philosopher who works really with the term of becoming instead of feminism, and is critic of the word utopia. She has, for example, coined that term embodied utopias to stress just to sort of critique the usual planning practice that often sort of suggests things into the future that look very much the same as they look now. So that let's say the missing radicalism in those proposals, which you already see when you look at visualization, at images where there's often the Swedish white middle class family is represented, but not, let's say, not the world as it looks like, not the variety of different bodies with different abilities, for example. Okay, but I will hand over to Therese. Is that okay, or should I?
Okay. All right, so as Mejke said, I should change place. My name is Therese Kristiansson, and I work together with Mariana Alves Silva and Katarina Bonnevie, and also currently Ullis Olgren is part of our family. And I thought I would start with just a quote from the text, actually, which is a dialogue between the 3 of us. And yeah, I'll read it. Mariana says, "I think that anger is an important driving force for many, which often results in criticism as a strategy for resistance. where everything circles around punctuating patriarchal and racist ideas and to counteract them. It affects people to constantly have to fend something off. When the body is constantly located in a hostile or threatening situation. It influenced me a lot for a long time, and eventually I felt clogged by all the rotten ideas and their attached forms. And actually, the aesthetics weren't challenged enough either. So to start working suggestively instead was a survival technique or a maneuver. It's not helping us to constantly pronounce what we think is ugly. Instead, we need to define what we think is beautiful and wonderful. That is generous, and generosity spreads. It takes courage to suggest, since one has to try and navigate through what is often unknown grounds. And such a process requires a lot of support, which we give each other. In some way, it becomes a simultaneous process where we provide space for both ourselves and for others. There is an urgent need for more spaces with conditions for suggestive work to develop. And Katarina says, Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick, her text on touching feeling, gave me words to understand that I'm striving for, or what I'm striving for. Criticality is significant, but the promise lies in the proposal that touches you. And I think that I just reread the text before coming here, and I really love that quote. And I also, coming from the demonstrations of 1st of May yesterday, I kind of also really feel the need of articulating that society that we want to have rather than just criticizing the one we are in. But I'll tell you more specifically about the text, which tells the story of an art project that we did for the Gothenburg Biennal in 2013, which we called Exclude Me In. I also see that I put in this quote by Emma Goldman, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution, which I guess you already maybe know. But we've been working a lot with the carnival as a way of temporarily redressing ourselves, redressing others, redressing the city in order to, if only for a moment, change the perspective of what we're doing. And the story of the invitation for the Gothenburg Carnival, Biennial, sorry, was to investigate the old carnival that used to take place in Gothenburg between the early 80s and the early 90s. And the Gothenburg Carnival was huge. At its peak, it had 200,000 participants. But it's kind of been, you could say, hidden in the storytelling of Gothenburg because it was in a way commercialized by the city of Gothenburg and turned into Göteborgskalaset, which forbid actually like these public dancing and carnivaling activities and instead placed beer tents and organized kind of music performances and such. So if you look into the history of Gothenburg, it won't say much about this carnival that engaged a lot of the city's inhabitants for over 10 years. But when we looked at the material of the Gothenburg Carnival, we kind of felt that there was lacking. We found like an abundance of dance and masks and costumes and banners that would fill Gothenburg during these days of carnival. But there was also an abundance of men, white men with names like the DJs and the performers and the artists, and like anonymous women that we understood would make the costumes and would do the banners and have the dance schools and such. And we also kind of saw a lack of queerness. And I kind of forgot to say, but our departure point within MYCKET is a queer feminist philosophy, you'd say. So we were like, there's so much like carnival is so important for the queer movement in general, how come we don't see any queers in all these images and videos that we found about the Gothenburg Carnival? And it turned out that Gothenburg at the time, in the 80s, was in Sweden, or in Swedish called bögknackarstad, which means into like, how to translate that, like a gay slashing city or whatever. And it was actually a time, a really brutal time in the history of Gothenburg, where a lot of gays, or several murders took place, hate crimes, and even the bombing of a queer club. So we thought, or I mean, the answer was kind of that people didn't feel kind of safe to be publicly queer. Instead, there was a huge underground movement of queer clubs, such as both dance clubs, but also just like book clubs and knitting clubs or whatever. So we did like a shout out to the queer community of Gothenburg and got help to map as many as we could of the clubs from the early 80s until now. And this is a mapping of that research, so one of the clubs was Swedish Dyke Vibes, or one was called Milk. There was the group of Golden Ladies. There was an institute called Queer Institutet, Kvinnohuset. So they're kind of all mapped in this map. And then what we did, we thought that we want to kind of set history right and make the queer part of the carnival that we couldn't see had existed. So we organized a new carnival, you could say, and invited the people that had helped us with the mapping to take part in it, but also, of course, just any citizen of Gothenburg or whoever who wanted to be part of our carnival. And this is a picture of the group. We were a large number of people. We're always a lot of people working together. We collaborate. We worked. You need space to work. You need cheap spaces to work in to be able to do things. We have a barn in Östergötland where we also live part-time. And we work a lot with trying to develop the aesthetics of queerness. Here are a couple pictures of the banners that we later hung in Gothenburg. Part of the costume making for the carnival. I'll be a little bit quick, right, because we don't have super much time. So here's an image of the actual carnival taking place. It went from Esperantoplatsen in Gothenburg to the club Nefertiti. We're around 200 participants, people holding banners of the club names, the different club names that we had mapped out. And here's another image. And it ended in this great dance party where we had Jean-Louis, who's called Dungeon Acid, who used to run an underground club in Gothenburg during the 90s, who was playing the music for us. And I wanted to also talk about, this is an example of kind of queer architecture, because we see the carnival as architecture because it becomes the space for a while, and space is, or spatial practice is architecture and such. But you can also ask yourselves, how can we do it more permanent? It's a very ephemeral and temporary practice or room. The space is very temporary. So this project actually led to a city planning commission that we did for the city of Gothenburg, which we called Playan in Frihamnen in Gothenburg, where we used a lot of the mapping from the carnival and to take in those perspectives in the suggestion that we did for the city of Gothenburg. We also worked with a lot of other groups, but focusing on women and newly arrived women to Gothenburg, a group with people that have different functionalities, and like you could say a group of also unemployed women and homeless women. And we went swimming with all of these different groups to try to investigate what bathing culture meant to them, because the commission from Gothenburg was, how do we facilitate bathing culture to these different groups? And so what we actually proposed, trying to take the knowledge from the carnival, the new knowledges of these groups, into like a new commission. We worked with trying to provide a space that people can take over. So in a way, a space that people can have a party at or kind of socialize at and feel that it's theirs, like a carnival, but not as pronounced maybe. So the space doesn't hold a pool as such, but what we actually did for Playan was to facilitate a deck which you can both walk, dance or roll on with a wheelchair or with a baby wagon, and sand to make you feel like you would be on the beach, and public grills and public tables which you can eat on and grill your food that you bring with, but also a kind of a container where we had a lock where we would give out the numbers to the lock with a sound system and electricity, so that different groups could borrow the space for their activities. So here is an image of Cinema Queer that held their open-air cinema during one summer there. And they would just borrow all the things and occupy the space for like an afternoon and evening, for example. That's an image from which I took from Instagram that belongs to them. Okay, so briefly trying to kind of talk about what we also discuss in the text, the different scales of architecture, the different ways of thinking about queer aesthetics. I guess you noticed kind of that things look a little bit alike, either if it's a costume or if it's a built space. That's it. Yeah, yeah. You're like, and we wanted to have a little bit of time for questions, right? Yeah. Thanks.
So, any questions? Yes?
Hi, I was just curious, could you say something about the Playan project? What is the Gothenburg city's take on it? Do they consider it to be a temporary installation, or how does it come about further on?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's considered a temporary installation, where there was like an idea of curating architecture more than building architecture. So it was set out to be a project that would be there for 3-4 years. I actually don't know if it's still there, because it's gonna disappear probably. But then it's also with those things that when you propose something temporary, if it works out well, it kind of sometimes just becomes permanent. So I'm not quite sure. But you can also say that we were part in a huge project where what we did, I'm not sure, you can say like, you can see we don't really have any control of what happens afterwards, or what kind of ethics are carried out afterwards. So it's just a small part of that huge process. Yeah.
More questions? No? Yes.
Hi. Did anything of this end up in a wish list for politicians?
Which do you mean the
project? Do you have wishes from politicians?
The wishes from wait, what do you? Sorry, I don't really understand.
Do you have thoughts about what you would like politicians to do?
What I would like
in
relation to this.
Yes.
I think actually, when I was giving you that answer, I think that it has changed a little bit now. Mike was briefly talking about the Boverket's funds, for example, now that you can apply for. And so what I would wish for, and which we lacked in this project, was time and money, more time, more like that these ideas would really go from the beginning to the end of a building project. And what goes with that is budget, of course. It matters if you get 1 million crowns or if you get 10 million crowns or 50, right? And actually now we're working on a project in Jönköping, in Råslätt, which is part of a project called Konsthänder, which the Public Art Council are working on. And there now, with this government that we're having, or have had now for a while, they pushed a lot of money into actually feminist city planning. So there we have an entire differently budget, and we can actually go from work like building a more, let's say, temporary structure like this one, to actually also having money to plan for like a bigger permanent structure. So that is what I think I would like consistency, more money. And somehow this like, it doesn't really help. It's so frustrating. In the beginning we were asked to be like small infusions into projects. Maybe you have like a really engaged middle boss or something that is feminist and wants to implicate those questions. But if you don't have like the leading group with you in different questions, you will never be able to carry through something really. So we're kind of trying also to take a take on the management in general, that everyone knows why it's important, because otherwise it will get like, I don't know, not prioritized in the end.
So one last question.
Adding then, you say that it's temporary and it's frustrating and you would like it to be a more permanent structure and so on, but do you think that you maybe arranged a forum for a new social group that could influence the politicians and add to the planning or the building in other places? Or did you have any experience of that?
In other places? You mean that this temporary space could still work as a inspiration?
Yeah, I mean that the temporary space, it doesn't have to have the physicality doesn't have to be the end goal, but the arena of connecting new people and giving them power to articulate towards politicians or other projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely think so. And I guess that's been like our main goal. And then it's just if you kind of succeed with that, giving those groups that otherwise are not represented in city planning processes, and they temporarily take over that space, and they temporarily have space and take place, you kind of would like that the next hand comes in and like, okay, we'll really take your needs seriously and also build like permanent structures for those needs. But I definitely think that it's like it's the only starting point you can have somehow into inviting, trying people to get engaged and feel that they at least have the right to have opinion. And so, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for coming and giving this interesting talk. And I don't know if you know, but we usually give the lecturers a book. And now we do have more if you want one copy each. So this is another Art in KTH book. If you don't have, and
thank you.
Thank you
we
very
can
much.
Share.
Yes,
Nice, thank you much.
Thanks again for
so
coming.
fun to be here. Thank you for coming to the lecture. Thanks.